I'm not going to introduce Dean. We all know who he is. I have two things that I want to say, and then I'm going to turn it over to Dean, and I mean this with all sincerity. I came here this morning really not sure of what I was going to hear or listen to, but you know, Dean, two things you've said, and I've written them down here, and it's really just been an aha moment because looking out at this audience, I feel really inadequate in a lot of ways. I have no concept of loss at this point in my life. I've been blessed with a wonderful marriage, 3 healthy kids, and God has blessed me with a career. But I've got to be careful not to let my comfort zone become my idol. That was my first aha moment. I've got to get off the merry-go-round. The second thing you said that really stood out to me is the greatest things in life are achieved outside of my comfort zone. I am so glad that I was here this morning to hear that, and I look forward to what you have this afternoon.
Now I know what it's like to be on cloud 9. That was such a nice compliment. Is the sound okay, Mark? Okay. What is it like to be widowed? I didn't know about this, but I started finding out about this even at the end of December of 2013. And since I lost my wife, one of the blessings that's come from that, it sounds weird to say that a blessing could come from the loss of your wife. I've met a lot of people who have become a great inspiration to me because they've lost their spouse too. And I have been amazed and inspired by what I'm learning about them. Many of them have become very frank with me, very transparent about what their life has been like since they lost their spouse. If you want to know what it's like to live after the loss of your spouse, then just listen for a few moments. I'll read you their very words. Here's some members of the Lord's church. I'll share with you some of their observations. A sister of ours who lives in Searcy, Arkansas, said, "I wasn't a person anymore. Couples turned their backs on me." Marcia Stapleton, who was married to Robert Stapleton, said this. She'd been married for 47 years. Her husband, Robert, some of you may have known, missionary for many years. Here's what she said 2 years and 3 months after her husband, Robert, passed away. "I know I have to do the best each day, but that is hard at times. I never dreamed it would be this difficult." Remember that young lady I told you about in Southwest Georgia whose husband committed suicide, Miss Buffy? She said, 8 years ago, I married my best friend. 8 years ago, I never imagined my life would be the way it is now. I never dreamed until death do us part, that part of our vows would become my reality so quickly. Miss Patty in Middle Tennessee said this in September of 2021. "The mornings are so lonely. As I drink my coffee that he always made, I miss him reading the scriptures because I knew that he'd been up and been doing that for a while. I long to hear that voice again. It's been 48 days, and the ache is almost unbearable at times. I've gained a new respect for all who have lost someone that was the best part of us. Miss Wyvita, who lives in Arkansas, said, I miss him so. Knowing he is in heaven doesn't stop the pain and the loneliness for the one left behind. Leela lives up in Ohio. And she said, we did everything together. We were married for 48 and a half years when a tiny germ, she calls it, a tiny germ, COVID, took his life. I am struggling with extreme loneliness. The house is so quiet and no longer alive with joy. Let me read to you some others from some books. There is a lady who has written a book called The Mediocre Widow. And in that book, she talks about the struggle that she had with her life. During the first year, it seemed like I was in a constant state of emotional agony. I would sit with a photo album in my lap and flip through the pictures of a man I just couldn't believe was actually gone. In a book called The Widow's Mite, here's what one lady said. The space inside of me previously occupied by that passionate relationship was strangely empty. I went from having someone think I was the most amazing person on earth to feeling invisible and vacant. There is a lady who teamed up with a man and wrote a book called Getting to the Other Side of Grief. He had a pastoral counseling kind of background and she had a nursing background. And here's what the female with the nursing background said in the course of that book. I wanted to kill myself. Going to bed alone at night was so hard, I prayed that God would let me die. I wanted out of this life. I love this very transparent writing here in a book called The Widow's Mite. She said, if I could have one positive thing come from Dale's death, it would be the ability to explain in words the utter, overwhelming sadness of the loss. One of the primary differences between the death of your spouse and the loss of anyone else is that you have a level of physical intimacy with your spouse that you do not have with anybody else. That, combined with the sheer amount of time that you spend together, heightens the loss. Until you live it, I'm not sure that you can totally wrap your thoughts around the crushing magnitude of losing a spouse. Even as a strong woman with a powerful faith walk, a wonderful family, and a large support group, I was brought to my knees by Dale's death. I have totally changed how I think about life, marriage, and myself. Whatever happens in my future, I will never be the same. Here's a brother in the Lord who was a teacher and also a preacher. He said, now I live in a time that I do not understand. It is a lonely world of darkness that I no longer fit into. I have no one to care for but myself. The one I devoted myself to is now gone. He gets even more frank in this writing that he shared with me. He said, frankly, my life stopped that day. That's not the way we planned it. My whole life was gone, and she was not supposed to die before me. We thoroughly discussed everything we did. She even laid out my clothes every morning to make sure we matched every day. So he says toward the end of this that he shared with me, the struggle that he has, dealing with the reality that after 50 years, she's not with him anymore. One lady wrote this: just as a recovering alcoholic is never free from the desire for a drink, so too I am a recovery griever, never free from my desire for the life that I had before. There just aren't any 12 steps to help me. I could go on and on for several minutes reading things like that. I had no idea. I had no idea. Whenever I started with the Lord's Church in Hartville, Ohio in August of 1981, I was 27 years old. And I worked there with that church for 33 years. At the 32-year mark of being with that church is when my wife died. And during that 32 years, I was present and with and ministered to people at their moment of loss. I could see their heartache. It was so obvious. I heard their cries, and I shed tears with them. What I'd learned in that 32 years was loss is really hard to deal with. What I was ignorant of, though, until my wife died, was what life was like after loss. What I'd learned was loss is really hard. What I was still totally ignorant about is what a challenge it is to live life after loss. That's what I didn't know about. I didn't even know enough to ask the right questions of those people who had lost their spouse, because I'd never read anything about widowhood before. So how would I know what questions to ask to find out about how they were doing and what their needs were? But then when my wife passed away, and I became the person who was beginning to question myself and ask what's wrong with me, that's when I felt compelled to read everything I could get my hands on about what other people were dealing with in their life. What's it like to live after the loss of your spouse, to deal with the greater challenge? Loss is a tremendous challenge, but there's something else that's bigger than that. Loss is a big challenge. The bigger challenge is living with that every day and every night for the rest of your life. Whether or not you get married again or not, that doesn't change the fact that you have lost this precious person in your life. No matter what else you may lose the rest of your life, you've got to deal with the fact that for the rest of your life, you are wounded by virtue of that horrific loss in your life. How do you deal with that the rest of your life without it becoming your identity? By the way, your identity is not your marital status. Your identity has nothing to do with your marital status. It has nothing to do with your age. It has nothing to do with your physical appearance. Your identity has everything to do with God. You exist in the image of God. You exist after His likeness, Genesis 1, 26 and 27. That is your identity. Now, in the course of living in His image and after His likeness, you're going to experience some things, both good and bad. But those things that you experience are not your identity. None of them are. Your identity is linked to your relationship with God. The fact that you exist in His image and after His likeness. But the reality is, you've lost your spouse. This is Millie Hartman. I apologize, I guess, to all other widowed people I've ever met. She's my favorite. Let me tell you why. I met this lady in her upper 90s on the north side of Cincinnati, Ohio. I was preaching in a gospel meeting. The preacher, his name's Mark, he came to me and he said, "Dean, I've got this lady. She's 90 plus years old. She wants to take you out to lunch." What does a 90 plus year old lady want to do with a preacher taking him out to lunch? I said, "Mark, just set it up so she takes me out to lunch." We went to a Japanese restaurant, which I thought that was weird. I did not know that 90-plus-year-old women ate at a Japanese restaurant, but that's where she took me for lunch. So we went in, we sat down, and we ordered our meals. And when the waiter left, I did the same thing with her I love to do with people, especially widowed people. I said, Millie, tell me your story. She kind of had a quizzitive look. I said, tell me about your life and your love and your loss. So she proceeds to tell me about this guy that she was married to for 63 years. And she tells me about how he was as a father, about their life together, about him getting cancer, about her being the caregiver, and about him dying. And then she drops this conversational bomb. She says, but that wasn't my first husband. And I was shocked. 63 years. She's in her early 90s now. I said, Millie, tell me about your first husband. She said, well, his name was Ray Farmer. We were 19 years old. He was 24. She was 19. She said, I was 19 years old. We already had one child, about a year old, and I was pregnant with our second child. And Ray was in General Patton's army in the Battle of the Bulge, and he died there. And I can quote you exactly what she said right after that. Quote, I had him buried in France, a decision that to this day I regret. End of quote. Now, I want you to stop and think about this for a minute. Mid-1940s, a 19-year-old girl who's pregnant, who also has a 1-year-old child, whose husband, Ray Farmer, is dead because he was in the Battle of the Bulge. How in the world did that woman survive? How in the world did she cope with that life circumstance? About 4 years later, she married the guy that she was married to for 63 years. After I heard her story, and if I did workshops after that, sometimes I would call her afterwards and say, Millie, I want you to know I told your story. I wanted her to know that her story, her personal story, had value. That she was proof of the fact that you could survive terribly difficult life circumstances. That you could cope and that you could actually be somebody else's inspiration. That you could find worth and value in your life after your loss by the way you react to the awful experiences that you have in life. Well, July 4th of 2018, July 4th of all days, she died. I thought that was so appropriate that she died on July the 4th. That's why I call her my favorite widow. She is an inspirational life story. Well, what are the risk factors to getting widowed? The first thing you got to do is say, I do. The second thing you've got to do is you got to stay married. Not everybody who says I do stays married. And then if your heart is the one that keeps beating, those are the risk factors. You're it. When two people are married, the words are, until death do us part. Well, I don't know if you're as slow a learner as I am. It took me several decades to figure this out, but 1 out of 1 dies. In every marriage that goes until death do us part, there's going to be one person that's left behind. What's that like to be left behind like that? Well, I want to think out loud with you now about some things that are commonly associated with widowhood. Tell me something that in our culture would commonly be related to widowhood. When you think of being widowed, what do we think about? Give me an example. Give me at least a half a dozen. Somebody start us out.
Loneliness.
Being lonely. That is almost always the very first thing that's mentioned. It's a loneliness like no other loneliness. See, there are 8 billion people on planet Earth. How many people of the 8 billion are you married to? 1. If that thought, if that reflection doesn't make your marriage special, there's little hope for you. You stop and think about how unique that is. And now that one person is gone. It's a natural thing to feel very lonely. Kathie Lee Gifford, you know, NBC, Today Show. She was married to Frank Gifford. Some of us people who are older than dirt remember Frank Gifford in his New York Giants football uniform. They were married for 29 years. He was much older than she was. Well, after 29 years, he died. Now, she was interviewed in AARP magazine. Now, I have no business getting this magazine. I read it at a library probably somewhere. But in an interview in the AARP magazine, she said after Frank died in 2015, she experienced a, quote, crippling loneliness. End of quote. Crippling loneliness. Now, when you think of Kathie Lee Gifford and where she lived for many years, what geographic area do you think about? New York. Very densely populated place. In the Tennessean, the newspaper publishing company out of Nashville, she said, I moved here. She lives in Franklin, Tennessee now. I moved here because I was dying of loneliness. That phrase, crippling loneliness, it's interesting to me that that phrase was used by an 80-plus-year-old guy that I called on the telephone in West Tennessee when I was inviting him to a widowhood fellowship that we launched in West Tennessee. I'd never met him before. I'd heard that he had lost his wife. I got his telephone number and I called him. Now here's 2 guys on the phone who've never met. And guys don't have a tendency to share real personal stuff with other people. And here, cold turkey in this conversation, it's interesting that he used the same phrase to describe himself that Kathie Lee Gifford used. He said he had a crippling loneliness. Yeah, it's a very difficult, challenging thing to deal with. Now, if people are the answer to loneliness, Kathie Lee Gifford was in the perfect geographic location, a densely populated place with millions of people. See, people are not the answer to loneliness. More people, we have more people on planet Earth now, but yet have more lonely people than we've ever had before. The antidote to loneliness is not people. It's the Lord. Well, give me something else that you would associate with widowhood besides loneliness. Sadness, okay. Loneliness, sadness, what else? Anger. What would you have to be angry about? Let's say that the husband or wife you lost was a faithful Christian. Well, who is a faithful Christian after death with? The Lord. To be absent from the body, 2 Corinthians 5, is to be present with the Lord. Now, why would you be angry about that? They're where you want to go, right? So why are we angry? Who would we be angry at? Any suggestions? There's more than one answer.
Ourselves.
Okay, maybe angry at ourselves. Maybe we think that we did something wrong. I talked to a lady in Fort Scott, Kansas, who had gotten COVID. And she, in her head, she gave COVID to her husband. She lived and he died. So whose fault is it he's dead? It's her fault. That was the first conversation I had with her on the phone. Sometimes we can be angry with ourselves after somebody has passed away. That's our spouse. Who else might we be angry at? The person who passed away. Here's this person who's passed away, whether suddenly or after long-term illness. So we're mad at them? Why are we mad at them? They left us. In Florida, Cheryl Wayne and I met this lady who admitted to us that sometimes after her husband passed away, when she was taking a shower, she would beat the side of the walls of the shower and say, "Why did you leave me? Why did you leave me?" Well, it's not like he chose to leave her. But see, there were things going on inside of her that caused her to feel that way. Now, who else might we be angry at? Ourselves, the person who died, God. Now, okay, why are we mad at God? Yeah, we selfishly want more time. I've talked to people who've been married over 50, over 60 years, and they always tell me the same thing. They wanted more time. So when's enough time? For us human beings, when's enough time? Never. But in this life, with marriage, all marriages, there's a beginning and there's an end. So we can be angry even with God. By the way, if you had a child who was angry at you, would you rather them withhold all of that? Or would you rather them blow up at you and express themselves? Which is going to be better for them and for you and your relationship? The blow up. There's only so much air you can put in a balloon. And at some point in time, it's going to blow up. But sometimes in that blow up, that's where some real progress can be made after that. You don't want that to be stuffed inside of us. So there are things that maybe we need to talk with the Lord about. And maybe we need a spiritual mentor to help us in regard to our relationship with the Lord. There's somebody else that we could be angry at that you haven't mentioned. Have you ever heard of a doctor who made a mistake? A nurse who made a mistake? A surgeon who took a wrong turn in the operating room? The medical profession is just flawed people who are knowledgeable, who are experienced, but they are imperfect people, and the medical profession makes mistakes. Sometimes our anger can be directed to the medical profession. Anger is not necessarily all bad if you handle it in the right kind of way. It can help you with your perspective later. It can help you in your relationships with others, including our relationship with the Lord, if we deal with it properly. If we don't deny it, don't suppress it, but we express it at the appropriate time with the appropriate people. Give me something else that you would associate with widowhood. Regret. One of the chapters in the book that I wrote, Before the End Comes, there's a chapter in there about regret. And one way to reduce regret, you can't eliminate it, but one way to reduce regret is to be the person you ought to be in the marriage. Be the caregiver that you ought to be in the marriage. But the reality is we're all human beings. So there are going to be things that we haven't done, that we should have done, or things that we did that we should not have done. So we are going to have to learn to deal with regret. I have regret, and I live with that regret and will to the day I draw my last breath. Sometimes the regret can even be inflamed to the point that it's self-inflicted guilt. It's not real guilt. I mean, guilt like in the sight of God, but sometimes we self-inflict guilt because it's extreme regret. Can you think of anything else that you'd want to mention?
Don't fit in.
You don't fit in. You are a social misfit. A social misfit. I did not realize that until after my wife died. I wished I would have known about that because I would have handled my relationship with those widowed people a whole lot different in that church. The Sunday before my wife died, there were 224 people at church that Sunday. Very healthy church environment. A beautiful place to have fellowship and serve the Lord with those brothers and sisters. But the reality is it was also a group of flawed people. I'm going to run through a bunch of stuff here, and we'll do it somewhat quickly, but feel free to express yourself as we go through these. Let's assume for a minute you lose your spouse. And you know full well that there should be grief because you've lost your spouse. But what if you don't feel a whole lot of grief? Instead of that, you kind of feel relief. Now, if you're supposed to feel grief, but you feel relief, what does that do to you? You're guilty. Inside, that's self-inflicted guilt. Yeah. Now, can you imagine any situation where somebody would die and there'd be some degree of relief, maybe even a whole lot of relief? Okay, if they were suffering and you knew that they were prepared for eternity, that would bring you relief. Okay, what else might cause you to feel relief?
Abusive relationship.
What about domestic violence? Abusive relationship, that person's now gone. Are you going to feel relief? Sure, you're going to feel relief because you don't have to deal with that anymore.
Being in front of your caregiver is hard.
Tomorrow morning, if the Lord permits, I'll tell you about the most difficult time in my life, the time when I almost snapped, and it was caregiving. And then to have that caregiving end, there is a relief. But then also, there's this huge vacuum that's created because you have developed a personal identity as a caregiver. Now that person is no longer there, so what are you? Now, if you're feeling a lot of relief instead of grief, like has been mentioned, you might feel guilty now. Well, what if you have the person who's passed away, but you're not shedding a lot of tears? How are you going to feel about that? If you associate somebody's death with shedding tears, but you don't cry much, you know, some people are not big on crying. They never have been. It's kind of a personality thing. Then there are others of us, myself included, that can cry at the end of a Hallmark movie. Now, I blame that for having a wife for 41 years and being exposed to 3 daughters. I have an affliction, a medical affliction, and it's called, I need to write this in handwriting on a medical journal, overexposure to the female gender. It can mess a guy up. You're just not normal. And so I can cry at the drop of a hat. I can shed tears really easily. Now, other people are not like that. As a matter of fact, there are people physiologically who can't cry. They can't. Now, if you're supposed to be shedding tears, but you're not, how's that going to make you feel? You're guilty again. Now, you see what a mess? See what a mess you are internally? Because you've got these things going on inside of you? You're going to experience a heartache that you've never experienced before because you've never lost your spouse before. But now you have lost your spouse, and you're going to start asking some questions that you have never, ever asked before. A lot of questions. As a matter of fact, some of those questions may have to do with God and may have to do with your church family. You know that bus I told you about? Let's get on that bus and go to a place in Cookeville, Tennessee. And we'll pull up to, we'll call him Brother Bill's house. And we'll sit down and talk with him. And we'll talk about how that for 400 days, every day, he had a brother or sister in the Lord that came in and helped him in regard to caregiving for his wife so he could have a couple of hours outside the house. After his wife passed away, there hasn't been a single person come to his house. It might raise some questions about your church family, as well as about God, and maybe about yourself. Like I ask, what's wrong with me? Well, then there's that loneliness that we talked about and the identity crisis. If you are somebody's husband or wife and they've died, are you still their husband or wife? And if the two become one flesh and you are a part of a couple, but the couple doesn't exist anymore, what are you? You could be in financial jeopardy. You could also, in addition to that, deal with a lot of the issues that come with forced change. and the neutral zone that you have to experience on your way from the change to the new beginning. And you've got to deal with the absence of the person. A few days ago, I was in Northeast Ohio with a good friend, and he took me in to their bedroom. We went through their bathroom to the closet door. He opened the closet door, and it was full of her clothes. She passed away earlier this year. She's gone, but the clothes are there. He's got to deal with the absence of his wife. When he looks at the chair where she sat, what does he see? Air, an empty chair. When he comes to the church building and comes to worship in a public setting, who does he sit beside? The two hardest places for a widowed person to go, and this is having conversed with literally hundreds of widowed people, the two hardest places for a widowed person to go, not necessarily in the order of importance. One is to bed, an in-your-face reminder that you are A-L-O-N-E. And number two is to church. Now, I know that we commonly, with our lack of experience and lack of knowledge, we commonly associate coming to church, that's a place where there's love and praise and joy and fellowship. We think of a lot of positive things. For a person who's lost their spouse, though, who's been going to church for years with that spouse, it is a blunt reminder. Do you sit in the same place? You know, I assume tomorrow morning I'm going to have to ask this question. Is this a church that has assigned seating? Most churches do. As a matter of fact, in Murray City, Tennessee, where I was preacher for 5 years after my wife passed away, they not only had assigned seating, they had assigned parking. I mean, I knew where everybody parked in the parking lot. By the way, that's a sign of old age. I just thought I'd tell you that in case you didn't know that. It's a sign of old age. But where do you sit? When Cheryl Wayne and I were in Mission, Texas, way down there at the Rio Grande, there was this young couple. This was before the workshop. They came up with this idea, novel concept. This young couple, when they come to church on Sunday morning, they spy out to find a widowed person. They go to the widowed person and they ask, "Can we sit with you today?" Isn't that a neat idea? Two young people came up with that idea. Well, there's even more. It's not uncommon to dream about the person that you've lost for years afterwards. Now, not constantly, but periodically. I have talked to widowed females who have been widowed for 15 plus years, and on occasion they still dream about the person that they lost. That doesn't mean you're going crazy. That means you're human. You have to deal with the silence. What does a widowed person do in the morning when they get up in a silent house? What are you going to do? What do you think your inclination would be? You're used to noise, but what are you going to do? Do you know what most people do? Turn on the TV or turn on the radio. Sometimes the silence can be deafening. There's an emptiness that you are going to experience that you're going to have to learn to cope with, and you have a dependence that you need to recognize. The next time I hear a guy, and usually it's a guy, usually it's south of the Mason-Dixon line too. I'm a Yankee, so I'm somewhat biased. If I hear one more guy say, "Well, Dean, all you got to do is pull yourself up by your bootstraps," I think I'm going to snap if I hear one more guy say that. You know, that is really not a very holy perspective. I have another perspective, more consistent with Scripture. How about "I need thee, oh, I need thee. Every hour I need thee." And how about recognizing the fact that it's through him that I need, that I'm assisted often most effectively by his people, in his family, in his kingdom, in his army. We need to let other people help us. Some of us grew up with parents that just insisted that we become doggedly independent. And I love that spirit, but at the same time, we need to understand that there's a need for recognition of dependence. No human being goes through crises without being changed. Whether you created the crises or somebody else created the crises in your life, but when you're in a crisis situation, you will be changed. One of the things that I think that is a healthy change is for those of us who maybe become independent to a fault, recognize the need for other people's help. What do you get out of helping other people? What do you get? What benefit have you derived from helping other people? How does that make you feel? Joy. It's more blessed to give than to receive, right? That's what Jesus said. Well, if you're going to give, there has to be a recipient. Now, what if those people that you have blessed with your ministry, you're helping them, you're service. What if they had said, no, I don't want your help? What have you impeded? You've impeded a display of God's love for you through them. See, I need to be willing to humbly accept the fact that I need help. It's okay to accept the fact that you need help, to let other people help you. Some of us have a really, really hard time doing that. We need to get over that. We need to depend on the Lord and depend on his people to help us in times that we need that help. The stress level is unbelievable because we've never dealt with this before. And like we've said, we have that anger that we have to deal with. And then what do we have to be worried or fearful about? Now, I know the Bible says, do not worry. But you know about us people. We're really good at not doing what we should do. Well, what do we have to worry or be afraid about if your spouse dies? What are you going to be worried or fearful about? Can you name some things? Future. Finances. Decisions. Who's going to make those decisions now? You know those decisions where you sat and talked together and each were a sounding board for the other and helped the two of you to come to a consensus about what to do? Who's going to have to do that now? It's all on you. Recognizing that dependence, then having people in your life, go-to people in your life for assistance about maybe things that are financial or things that are spiritual or things that have to do with physical things like a car or a house or whatever. You know, worry is a very tempting thing when you get in an extreme situation in your life. And it doesn't get much more extreme than losing your spouse. And then there's restlessness. The tossing and the turning. On December 30th of 2013, I got a telephone call. That was the day we buried my wife. Well, we thought we buried my wife. Larry, the funeral director, called me. Now, this was December 30 of 2013 in Northeast Ohio. So you can imagine the snow and the cold. And there was a tent there. We had to be at the bottom of the hill. The hole for her body was about halfway up the hill. So he calls me on December 30th. After we did the committal service at the bottom of the hill, we left. So that night, after dark, he calls. He said, Dean, we weren't able to put her body in the plot. I don't know if you've ever seen this done, but they have like a triangular thing that lowers the vault that has the casket inside of it into the hole. Well, it was slippery because of all the snow and because of the incline. And he said, we had to quit. He said the vault is half above the ground at an incline and half under the ground. We just have to leave it there overnight. We can't do anything else. How do you think I slept that night? And just thinking about that. and imagining what was inside of that casket. And there are things that you think about. It could be at nighttime, it could be any time during the day, that are going to cause you to feel very restless. And that's all a part of a human being dealing with an excruciating loss in their life. It doesn't mean you're going crazy. A lot of times, I wish I had $1 for every time somebody said something to me about how they thought they were going crazy after they lost their spouse. That is not an indictment as a weak person of faith. That is an honest statement about the frailty of being human. And then there was this guy in West Virginia who came to me and added that last one. He said, you need to put this on there. He was about an 80-year-old guy who had thick glasses on, bald-headed, and I could tell the water was beginning to accumulate in his eyes. He said suicidal thoughts. Have you ever thought, probably not, I hadn't either until in recent years, about some of the very people who are in this big room with you worshiping, or in your big room at your church building, who have been having suicidal thoughts because of something they're going through in their life? Could be in their marriage, could be in their family, could be in regard to their work, some sort of stressor that they're dealing with. In the studies that I've looked at that rate the stressors of life, the number 1 and number 2 life stressor in all those studies I've ever seen are always the same thing. Number 1 is loss of spouse, the death of your spouse. The second is divorce. In both cases, what have they lost? They've lost their marriage. Not an easy experience in life. Why is it so difficult? It's the only relationship described in the Bible with those 2 words, one flesh, the only one. The parent-child relationship's not described like that. The child-parent relationship's not described like that. The sibling relationship is not described like that. The husband and wife relationship is described like that. That makes it pretty unique. Now, if you had a good marriage, this is the way you do it. Take this one and share it with every married person you know, especially if you've been through loss and they know that you've been through loss. Challenge them to take this prescription and apply it to their marriage. Total giving of the total self for a total lifetime. Now, if you're the kind of person who has that spirit, and you're married to a kind of person that had that spirit, you have the best of marriages, magnificent marriage. You can't have a perfect one. You can't take 2 flawed people and create a perfect marriage. But you can take 2 flawed people and you can create a magnificent marriage by both of them buying into total giving of the total self for a total lifetime. And then that person dies, and it doesn't exist anymore. How do you think you're going to feel? What's the magnitude of the struggle that you're going to have? It's no wonder that you're going to struggle. Now, there's a lot of things that's going to make it unique. There are all kinds of things that are going to make it unique. One of the reasons why we should never say to somebody else, I know how you feel, even if you're a widowed person who's lost their spouse. And maybe you've been married the same number of years. And maybe your wife or your husband died under the same or similar circumstances. Never say to that person, I know how you feel, because you couldn't possibly. We're individuals. Individuals are different. Relationships are different. Families are different. Some families are very talkative. Some families are very functional. Some families, not so much. Some families are extremely dysfunctional. And then you've got the fact that, Brittany, who was married for 1,300 days, she loses her husband. Millie was married to her second husband for 63 years. There's a big difference. That's going to impact the life after loss. And then whether or not we have faith and how much faith we have is going to make a difference too. In Mark 9, there's that very touching story about the man who had the afflicted child who was demon-possessed, and he came to the Lord and begged the Lord for the healing of their child. And he declared, I believe, and then he said something else. What went with that? Help my Unbelief. You know, it's not necessarily a bad thing or a bad sign to struggle with your faith. As a matter of fact, that might be a blessing. It's kind of like the painful blessing of going to the gym because you haven't taken care of yourself, and now you decide to recommit yourself to a better, healthy lifestyle. You're going to get in the gym, and you're going to exercise, and you're going to have pain as a result of that. But that is going to be for your betterment. Sometimes when we struggle with our faith, if we don't ignore that faith struggle, if we don't ignore or deny the doubts that we have, and instead we seek to struggle in the right kinds of ways, seeking ways to deal with our doubt, we can actually come out of that faith struggle stronger. Just like you come out of the gym, the YMCA, stronger. Struggling with your faith is not necessarily something to be ashamed of. If you struggle with that faith, with a spirit that you are not going to give up on the Lord. You know, Job, as you read chapter 3 through chapter 41, he really struggled. He did not understand God. He did not understand what in the world was going on. He thought God was, well, let's put it bluntly, he blamed God. He would come right out and said, "Why are you doing this to me?" But he ends up being blessed in his struggle. It is a challenging time. Now, Cheryl Wayne has a little gift to give anybody here who is a widow or a widower. If you are presently a widow or a widower, Cheryl Wayne is going to bless you with a gift. Oh, it's priceless. Are we going to call these priceless? No. Throw me one of those. I can't get my packet open.
Welcome to the club.
Everybody who's widowed, I want you to receive one of these. Now, there are two purposes of this fork. You can use this fork to eat if you want to lose weight. That would be a very effective way of losing weight. Now, that's not the purpose for which I give it to you. I want you to take this if you're widowed, and I want you to put it somewhere where you'll see it every day. Now, here's why. After you've lost your spouse, you are on a journey you didn't want to go on, but you don't have any choice. It's a grief journey. And in your grief journey, after you've deeply grieved, what you have to realize is at some point in time, you've come to a fork in the road. Now, I could have had an image there where you have a fork in the road, but I thought maybe this would be more graphic to see the fork laying in the road. When you pick up a fork, what have you done? What have you decided? What did you decide over there in that room when you picked up a fork? I'm going to eat. Now, what else have you decided with that fork in your hand? How much am I going to eat? What else have you decided? What you're going to what?
What you're going to eat.
What you're going to eat. I am going to eat. How much I'm going to eat. What else are you going to decide? How often you're going to eat and when you're going to lay this down and quit eating. See, this fork, when you take this fork, you're starting to make decisions. At some point in time in your life, what you need to do is realize that you've got to start making some decisions about your life. Now, you can't do that early on. It's not possible. Whenever you've lost your spouse, early on, what you're dealing with is a closed door. Not only has that door of your life been closed, it's worse than that. It's been locked. When you're deeply grieving, you just stare at that door and cannot believe that that door is shut. As a matter of fact, that door has been slammed shut. And you just look at it for a long time. And at some point in time, you become inquisitive. You grab a hold of the knob, but then you find out it's a locked door. So there's a brutal reality here. A door's been slammed shut, and now it's locked. What are you going to do with the rest of your life? I'm sure you know the story of Helen Keller. And one of the interesting observations that she made is this. When one door of happiness closes, another one opens. But often, we look so long at the closed door, we do not see the one that's been opened for us. Now, we can't look for open doors right after our spouse dies. And how long a person deeply grieves, I don't know. That's up to the individual. For some people, it's shorter. For some people, it's a lot longer. But at some point in time, we've got to realize that we're the one that's still breathing. We're the one still existing in the image of God and after His likeness. What am I going to do the rest of my life? One of the things I wrote about in the third book that just came out, August 19th of this year, which happens to be, that would have been, our golden wedding anniversary. Amazon sent me an email and said the book's now available for sale. In that book, After the End Comes, there is a chapter in that book about ministry after loss. When we're married as Christians, often we're involved in the ministry of the other, and we kind of work together. I don't know how many, one of the things I talked about in that chapter, I don't know how many cute little colorful things I cut out because my wife was a cradle roll teacher. I don't know how many things that we did together to help decorate her classroom. She helped me a lot with a lot of different things of a secretarial nature. Received a lot of calls, took a lot of messages. When you're working together as a couple, your ministries are complementary. You might be involved in different ministries, but you're complementary with each other's ministry. When that person dies, you're still a Christian. A Christian's a servant. You weren't saved just to sit on a comfortable chair at a church building. You were saved to serve. So what do you do in the way of ministering? And so in that third book, After the End Comes, I talked about that very issue. We have to decide what we're going to do with the rest of our life. Now with me, I prayed that the Lord would open a door of opportunity for me to continue to minister. I'd already resigned from the pulpit from a church that I loved dearly, that I'd been with for 33 years. I'd resigned from the pulpit to care for my wife. I wasn't about to push myself back in the pulpit. That could have split the church. So I had to find a church that would take me in. At 61 years old, I mean, who wants a 61-year-old preacher? Who wants a 61-year-old preacher that's not even married? And then if you're trying to relocate in the southeast part of the United States where your children and your grandchildren are, what church in that part of the country is going to take a Yankee who's 61 years old, who doesn't have a wife? It was a very hard thing. But there was a little church in Murray City, Tennessee, population 650. That wasn't the size of the church. That was the size of the town. The whole county was 14,600 people. They took me in. And we started a local widowhood ministry there. That grew to over 40 people monthly, sometimes over 50 people monthly, from all kinds of different religious groups, from which people came to know the Lord, came back to the Lord, and became Christians. Local widowhood ministry has great potential outreach. Amen. Widowhood choices, what am I going to do with the rest of my life? Well, one thing's for sure, you're released and free, whether you like it or not, whether you're feeling it or not. Miss Carolyn said one Sunday night to me in Murray City, Tennessee, she said, "Dean, do you still feel married?" I was still wearing my wedding ring at that point. By the way, that's another chapter in the book, After the End Comes. Rings. There's a chapter about rings. What do widowed people do with their wedding rings after the spouse has died? It's really interesting to do some research about that. You may still feel married, but you are not, because in God's perspective, which is wisdom, you're released or free. Now, in 1 Corinthians 7, people who are not married are uniquely described. And basically what the point is that Paul makes there in 1 Corinthians 7 is, you have a flexibility and availability as a single person you need to recognize. When you're married, you have a lot of responsibilities. And those are God-given to have the right kind of marriage. It's a ministry. Whenever you're married to somebody, it's a ministry. You're ministering to that other person that you love more than anybody else on planet Earth. But you've lost that ministry. So what are you going to do? Well, What are you going to do with all that time and all that effort that you invested in the relationship? This is a great time to recognize the blessings that you have when you're widowed. You're more available than you've ever been before. You're more flexible than you've ever been before. And you have very valuable experience. Do you know who could best help people who are struggling with difficult times? Who could best help somebody who's struggling with difficult times? Somebody who's been through a similar difficult time. Cheryl Wayne can tell you about the local widowhood ministry there in Carthage, Missouri, reaching out to people of all kinds of different religious groups. We have those same kinds of ministries going on in Tennessee and in Georgia and in Ohio, reaching out to people who are going through a very difficult time in their life. Not something they chose, but what we're trying to do is help them to make good choices after they've been forced to deal with something they didn't want, and that's their widowhood. So you take that availability and flexibility and that experience to help other people. I'm going to brag on Katrina since she's here and some of you know her. I'd have to go back in my texts to get at Katrina. I should have done it before I came here. I came home from church one Sunday in Murray City, Tennessee, and I got this text from Katrina. And Katrina said something like this, to paraphrase, I wanted to tell you what I did this morning at church. She said, after church, I went to a couple of young ladies who were married. And basically, she said, I coached them up. I encouraged them. I tried to encourage them to love their husbands, to be great mothers, and to have a wonderful marriage. Now, my suspicion is Katrina doing that as one who's experienced the loss of a spouse twice. What she said to those young ladies was a whole lot more powerful than Scott saying something up here, even in his best suit and tie, because of experience. Whatever painful experience you've been in your life, not just loss, but any painful experience that you've had in your life, use that painful experience for the glory of God by helping other people in their storm that may be very similar to the storm that you've experienced. Don't do it like a know-it-all, because nobody does know it all. Here's one thing that we need to wrap our brain and our heart around. Nobody knows everything about anything. Nobody. Nobody. Now, there are people who think they do, and there are people who have given me that impression, but that's not the case, because nobody knows everything about anything. So we can help other people, and other people can help us. We need to be the kind of people who are willing to try to help other people, but do it with a spirit of humility, knowing that we don't know everything, but we know some things from what we've learned, especially by experience. So that's my challenge to all of us. Now, tomorrow morning in Bible class, we're going to talk about praise the Lord no matter what. And then in the sermon time on Sunday morning, we're going to talk about what we ought to do when we're overwhelmed. And then at the 5 o'clock session, if you know anybody who's not yet married. Now, they could be divorced, they could be widowed, they could be a teenager, they could be a young adult. Text them and invite them to come tomorrow at 5 o'clock. If you need to pay a teenager $10 to come tomorrow at 5 o'clock, pay the $10 to get them here. Because we're going to talk about some things that we need to think about and make sure that we implement before we ever say, I do. Whether it's before loss or after loss, but especially after loss. There's a lot of things that we need to do to make sure that if we enter into another phase of being married, that we do it with our eyes wide open and as prepared as we possibly can be. So that's the challenge for tomorrow. Let's spend a moment in prayer. Father in heaven, thank you for your love and for the blessing of today. Thank you for the people who sacrificed their time, valuable time, to come here today. Father, we pray that you'll bless us with the courage and the wisdom to use what we've experienced to be a blessing to others. Father, be with those who are struggling with their life after the loss of their spouse. Bless them, Father, with the people and experiences they need to lift them up, to give them some direction when they're struggling the most. Father, help us to recognize the fact that we all need some help. It's okay to accept help, and it's really okay to give help, and help us to be willing both to give and to receive the assistance of others, especially our brothers and sisters in the Lord. Father, thank you for this good church, and thank you for this opportunity that they have provided others. Help us to use what we've learned today for your glory by helping others. It's in Jesus' name that we pray. Amen. Wes, do you need to say anything?
No, I'll just say,
Amen would be appropriate.
yeah. Amen, thank you, and I look forward to tomorrow. I've been very enriched and glad I was here today.
Enjoy the chillier weather.
I hope you find your ice cream today.
Yeah.